ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming along tonight. We're really pleased to have Penzance here. It's the process of doing really interesting research on tin and antiquity. That's really great. Before I start, though, a couple of things. Just to let you know that next Tuesday, we've got the Red River Singers here, singing traditional Cornish carols. We'll be setting those afterwards. We had and also we're taking donations afterwards, so thank you in advance for your donations. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Folks, firstly, thank you. This is a fantastic thing to be doing. I'm so glad to be here. It's wonderful because I recognise some of your faces, but mostly not. So it's a pleasure to introduce myself to you through the research that I've been doing. So folks, tin and antiquity, what is it about? Well, it's a period of classical antiquity, if you know that. That's the period in the first few centuries BC, throughout the Roman period and into the sub-Roman period. So that's the time period that we're talking about over here. Now, I feel like I say this a lot for things that I study and talk about. This really is one of my favourite topics. I have been absolutely captivated. I've been stung by the curse that is this topic. And it just has not escaped me ever since. So it's a real pleasure to present that to you. If you know nothing about the time period in question, this is not going to be a dense piece of academic literature. In fact, if you know nothing about the topic already, you are my target audience. And so it's a pleasure to take you along with the journey that I've been on myself. Aims to talk very quickly before we start. What I've done essentially is a literature review of classical antiquity as far as it relates to Cornwall, Devon, and the rest of the UK. And so this is, in many respects, this is kind of like the beginning of history. By doing this sort of study where we look back at Greek and Roman texts, we're actually looking back from the precipice of history into prehistory. That's really exciting for me. It's the genesis of that subject matter. We want to discuss the authors in question, but also the context of those events. This is really important. Some of you will probably have already heard the things that I'm going to be quoting from today, but it's the context that matters. In this sense here, the fancy posh word for it is hermeneutics. This is an hermeneutic study. What that means is that sometimes the context is more important than the content. So we're going to be doing an hermeneutic study. We're going to present evidence but not draw conclusions. There are two reasons for that. Firstly, I haven't finished the research. This is ongoing, and so my opinions might be subject to change. But also, and the most important reason, is that I don't know the answer. I want to present the evidence to yourselves, and then you can draw the conclusions in your own way. Perhaps you can continue the research or suggest improvements on what I'm doing. Most importantly, if I want to underscore one thing this research does, it proves that the Iron Age in Cornwall is not a prehistoric time period at all. Actually, it's a really rich historic time period that we can study as historians as well as archaeologists. So, very quickly, academic bits before we start. I have studied now well over 23 authors. Reverse that, 32 would be more accurate now, so that's out of date. But I've studied a couple of dozen authors, three dozen authors or so, in 5 different languages. I'm not fluent in any of them, by the way. So what I found is that out of these authors, quite a few of them, only about 5 or 6 actually explicitly mention British tin working. That's interesting. Of those 5, 3 are Greeks, 2 are Romans. I've also found 2 of the new earliest references in literature. I think this is really interesting, and it's a pleasure to present that to you as well. So they all seem to descend from what's known as a Pythéan archetype. So they all have a common ancestor in the literature sense. Don't worry about that. We'll come to that later on. So much of my study has been studying texts that I expected to mention tin working, but didn't mention tin working. I also might just say as well, because you can't take these things for granted, why is tin working important? Well, what is it that brings people from far away to Cornwall? Back then, it wasn't the beaches or the Eden Project. It was something that was kind of unique and special about us. And in this sense, Devon and Cornwall actually have something in common. It was our tin working. Tin is actually a really scarce resource on the global stage, on the European stage. There are a few places you can get it. Spain is one of the places. Central Europe's another one of the places. But Cornwall is possibly the most important. Certainly by the time you get to the 19th century, there's more tin that's worked in Cornwall than the rest of Europe combined. So the question is, was this importance also carried on in classical antiquity? So we want to be able to compare those different tin working regions as well. So we want to be able to compare, for example, Iberian or Spanish tin to British tin. So folks, the name of this talk, I scratched around, I've been researching this for years, and tin in antiquity is the best name I could think of because I am studying tin in the period of classical antiquity. Now, I didn't come up with this name. It was actually this chap over here, Roger Penhallow, who's already published a book to that name. So this talk is in a way dedicated to him. So we all know how the story ends. We've seen the amazing mining ruins of metallic around St. Just, so on and so forth. Each one of these red dots represents a mine shaft here. But how did it start? Well, after I've been researching this topic for a while, this is a natural question that I came to. And I remember volunteering in, for example, the Royal Cornwall Museum. That photo is not supposed to look like that, by the way. The joys of technology. And I remember reading this book over here by the great Alan Buckley. And in the very first chapter, you get this. This is an amazing piece of text. If you look at it, it says, the inhabitants of Britain who dwell upon a promontory known as Belerium are especially hospitable to strangers and have adopted a civilized manner of life because of their intercourse with merchants of other peoples. They it is who work the tin. Well, that's a little bit exciting. It goes on to describe that actually this is the southwest portion of Britain, or Cornwall. Now that text comes from this book over here, and I actually have that book with me right here. And what's wonderful about that book is that on one side, when you open it up, on one side it's got the original Greek over here, which if you study Greek, this is a form of Greek called Koine Greek, Common Greek. And over here you've got a translation into English. So it's really quite nice because you can cross-reference the two. Now, if you look very closely, it mentions over here, and we read through, they talk about this bed being like rock, contains earthy seams, and in the workers quarry the ore and melt them into pieces the size of knuckle bones. What are knuckle bones? And they convey them to an island that lies off Britain called Ictus. Judging by that sound, some of you have already heard this. Now, what he goes on to say is that Ictus is a place that is tidal. So with each tide, it becomes an island, or it's connected to the mainland, depending on where the tide is. Now, what does that sound like? Well, it sounds a little bit like this. Is there anyone in this room that doesn't recognize that island? That's the correct answer. And so it put me on this rabbit hole. Where is this place? And I was by no means the first person to study this. In fact, I.C. Maxwell was the last person to publish an article of this in the 1970s. So who actually wrote that text? Well, it was this chap over here. Don't be mistaken, folks. We do not actually know what he looks like. Diodorus, just here, delta iota omicron delta omega rho omicron sigma. Diodorus was a 1st century Sicilian Greek, and he's the person who's writing this book. He writes a book called Bibliotheca Historica, literally the library of history. I think it's a wonderful name for it. But the first question I had as a non-classicist when I started studying this, what's a Greek doing in Sicily? Well, this is really interesting actually, because why are the Greeks there at all? Well, this map is very, very relevant for understanding this. The Greeks go through a few turmoils. They have a few teething problems in the 2nd millennium BC. First of all, you have the eruption of Santorini. Okay, it's not great, but they recover from that. The real problem comes in something that they call the Late Bronze Age collapse. This is where you have sea peoples, as they call them, mainly people from Sicily and Sardinia, who actually go and invade and occupy the Greek homelands. It causes the Greek Dark Ages. Literacy is forgotten. And the new Greek civilization that arises out of this, the Homeric civilization, is a completely different one. It has a different language. People say different things. They study different things. It's a completely different culture. When they do recover, they get to a stage where they're importing grain from abroad. And so if you're importing your grain and land is scarce, why not go and form colonies? This is how the mindset works, you see. And so this is what gives rise to the age of the Greek apoikia, or the Greek colonies. And so what you find is that from mainland Greece itself, or from the Greek hinterland, they then go and settle all across the northern Mediterranean, starting from about 800 BC onwards. And so, for example, Italy is colonized, but also as far away as southern France as well. Places like Marseille are also colonized. But look at this. There's another color on this map. There's a rival civilization. In the Levant, you have the situation of Tyre, or Tyre, And they are also forming their own colonies. What they do is they go to the south and they form all these purple areas that you can see over here. So you have these two rival communities. The ones in purple, they are the Phoenicians. So this is really, really interesting here. We have two rival communities. We have the Greeks in the north of the Mediterranean and the Phoenicians in the south, beginning by about 800 BC and really coming into effect by about 600 BC. So this is what it would have looked like. This is actually a contemporary illustration of the sort of boats they would have used to do that. And there's a sort of fanciful illustration. So one of the first records we have of an actual Greek person that we know that has a name doing this is a chap called Kollaios over here. So Kollaios is a Samian Greek. He's from Samos. He's actually a subject of the Persian Empire at this time, but he travels westwards and he goes to Tartessos, which is the modern day Cardiff. What he finds there is fascinating. We don't know what he actually found firsthand because his written accounts haven't survived. But people that had read him copied him out, and then those records have survived. And this is what they say. The Phocaeans discovered the Adriatic and the Tyrrhenian and Iberia and Tartessos. Arriving at Tartessos, they are welcomed by the Tartessian king by the name of Arganthonios. That's such a cool name because that literally means silver king. So this guy was the king of silver. Why was he the king of silver? Well, it turns out that actually Tartessos was very famous for its silver mines back then. The way that we know this is because this chap over here has recorded this information. If we look at his bust, his name is Herodotus. Herodotus. So Herodotus, he is living in the 5th century BC. If you look at these dates, he's not quite a contemporary with Plato, I don't think, but he's around that sort of time. So you've got to have this in your mind when you're thinking about this. He is the person that invents the word history. If you're a historian, you're quoting him. Think about that, isn't that amazing? It's a bit of a funny word otherwise. So he lives in Elekonessos over here. Again, very similar place to Kollaios of Samos over here. He's also a subject of the Achaemenid or Persian Empire. So in a sense, he's always looking to the east because that's where all the culture and trade goes. However, there's also all this Western Mediterranean. We know that because Kollaios went there. He's fascinated by it. So this is the image you've got to have in your mind. It's not this fancy... Whenever we study these things, we have these wonderful modern satellite maps in our heads. You would do well to abandon it to understand the world that these people actually thought about. And this is what it would have looked like. We can reconstruct this from the texts that are written. What you see is that the Mediterranean is understood in essentially the same detail as it is today. And that's because the Greeks have been buzzing around their trading since time immemorial. But as soon as you go outside, things get very murky and wrong, ultimately, very quickly. So you have the Atlantic Sea, but then where's South Africa? Well, they didn't know that existed. What about Northern Europe? Well, they didn't know that existed either. And what happens if you go over here? We don't talk about that. And of course, there's no such thing as America either. So this is the sort of map that he would have imagined. Now, we often say that Cornwall is a land of saints. And we have good reasons for saying that, because you have St. Just and Morva, named after a saint, and St. Maud, and so on and so forth. Well, it turns out that the Greeks actually thought about the world in terms of saints or gods as well. For example, you had the Atlantic. Who do you think that's named after? Well, that's named after Atlas. And of course, when you look over here, you've got the ocean that surrounds. Who's that named after? Well, Oceanos was the king of the Titans. And so when you're literally sailing around, you're looking at that. Europa, another Titan. Asia, another Titan. So again, this was a land of gods in the same way that, in many respects, Cornwall is a land of saints. You see this tradition in terms of maps with Asia, Libya, and Europe, again, split into these quarters or thirds in, for example, really early Babylonian maps. This is the Babylonian world map over here. And it goes on to give rise to these traditions of T&O world maps, as you can see, Asia, Europa, Africa. And of course, you've got the Mare Magnum Foyer in the middle just there, which is the Mediterranean. And ultimately, that gives rise to things like the medieval Mappamundi. So that is a tradition that lasts for 2,000 years of map making. Going back to Kollaios over here, why is he travelling to the west? We answered that question very briefly. That's the image that you've got to have in your head of what his world looked like. He's doing that because of all the mines over there. This is the map that shows all the known mines from the Roman world. This is a little bit before that time, but the knowledge would have still been there. It's from the Oxford Roman Economy Project's mines database. Look at how many mines there are around Spain. This is why he's travelling to the Western Mediterranean. He's looking for mineral riches. In fact, we have an inscription from this time period that I found actually in the Greek epigraphy database that talks about exactly this kind of metalworking. In this case, though, it's not for silver or for lead. Have a look at this. So in the inscription, you can see just here the karpetanon over here, and then you've got parakomisen, and this is the really exciting bit, cassiteron. What does that sound like? Exactly, that's why I like you guys. So, Cassiterides. This is an inscription that talks about the Carpetani people from the modern-day Empúries in Catalonia. They are transporters of tin. That is really cool. This is from the 6th century BC. The 6th century BC, and we're talking about a tin trading tribe in Spain. I think that's wonderful. That's so cool. In fact, we have another reference to this, possibly, in the form of Herodotus over here, our old friend. He says, concerning the farthest western parts of Europe, I cannot speak with exactness. Remember, he's a Persian, and so he can only really find out things about the East. The West is a bit mysterious to him. Nor do I have any knowledge of the Cassiterides. That's a bit cool, isn't it? So the Cassiterides were literally the islands of tin, whence our tin is brought. He says that, nor for all my diligence have I been able to learn from one who has seen it, that there is a sea beyond Europe. He's just completely ignorant of it. This only we know, that our tin and amber comes from the most distant parts. Now, we know that it's coming from Spain, but the question is, did it come from Cornwall as well? This is the really exciting thing. Oh, and don't forget, whenever you hear something in English in this talk, it's always been translated. So have a think about what original language this came from. It wasn't just the Latin of Romans, it was the actual Greek over here as well. I think that's what's so exciting about this. You can see the original words that I've highlighted here. Cassiterides, Cassiteros, and then down here, of course, the description, tin from the most furthest western parts. So that's a kind of conjectural map, and you can see the Cassiterides are essentially in this mysterious ocean that he doesn't understand on the far west. So these are the authors that discuss the Cassiterides. You've got a load over here that are Greek. You only actually have one Roman in the end. What's very interesting is that as knowledge about the Atlantic increases, the discussions about the Cassiterides tend to decline. And so it seems to fall into this category of sort of pseudo-islands that they sort of gave this idea to. But as soon as better geographical knowledge came along, they stopped using it. So again, this is the map we've got to have in our minds of all those mines. There's so many mines when you go over to Spain. It is a really rich province. And of course, don't forget, we've got these two communities. We have got the Greeks up on the north, but we've got the Phoenicians, the Punics, or the Carthaginians on the south. And look at this, the Carthaginians have already started to lay claim to Spain. And so actually the Carthaginians have actually got access to that mineral wealth in a way that the Greeks don't. Most importantly, look at this, they control the pillars of Heracles over here as well, or the Strait of Gibraltar. Fun fact about the Strait of Gibraltar, it's called the Pillars of Heracles, which is the Greek version of Hercules, or the Roman version. Basically the story goes that Atlas was left straddling the strait, holding up the sky, of course, as the story goes. And so what Heracles came and did, he came along and built two mountains either side, so Atlas wouldn't have to do the job. And of course, that's where you get Gibraltar Rock. So one of the earliest references I found is a few centuries later, and it comes from this chap over here. Does anyone recognise this? Well, you can see it written there. That's a silly question, Ben. So folks, it's actually Aristotle. So Aristotle's a really, really interesting chap. If you ever researched him, his career is quite amazing. He's in relative obscurity, but through his knowledge, through his wisdom, he's asked to be the tutor to the most important person of the day in a rival kingdom, which I think is quite cool. So Philip II of Macedon goes and gets this chap over here to tutor his son. More on that later. But Aristotle is one of the most prolific authors of the time period. He wrote on just about anything. He was a true polymath. One of the things that he did is he collected together all sorts of weird stories about the far-flung regions of the world. And he put that in a book called On Marvellous Things Heard. I should really have the Greek version of that there somewhere. He says that they say that Celtic tin melts much more easily than lead. Now, he gives no more details than that, but he knows that Celtic tin exists. And what's interesting at the time period is that the Spanish tin was actually known as Celtiberians, or the Celts from Iberia. And so this reference to Celtic tin may well be the first reference to tin from Cornwall. So, do you know who this chap is over here? You could say he was great. You could say he was Alexander the Great. So this is the chap that Aristotle was tutoring back in his boyhood over here. So that's his illustrious career. So basically, Aristotle goes on to tutor this chap over here. Then he goes to form the Lyceum, and of course the amazing literacy that we see as a result of it. Now, Alexander the Great's quite impressive, actually. He's doing all of his conquering when he's in his 20s. So by the time that he was my age, he'd already biffed the Persians. And that's the fun part over here. You've got to remember that Greece wasn't Greece back then. It was a series of rival city-states. And they're sometimes collaborative, but most of the time they were rivals. There's no such thing as the Greek Empire in the same way you had the Roman Empire. And so when one Greek city-state did well, the others didn't clap and applaud. They went, oh, that's not great. That's not good. We want to do well. And it turns out that this chap over here is basically he's the king or the heir of Macedon. So one particular Greek city-state. What he does is he conquers over towards the east. He conquers Phoenicia, and he doesn't stop there. He then goes and rides through the Fertile Crescent. He goes and biffs the Persians. The Persians collapse. He is then the ruler of the Persian Empire, which he then renamed, but he doesn't stop. He keeps on going into India, and of course he arrives at the Indus Valley, which is where we get the river India from. What's amazing is that you can actually see envoys from China at this time, or I'm not sure, would it have been the Qing dynasty or the Han dynasty, actually arriving at the court of Macedon, essentially promoting Buddhism, which would have been quite amazing. Now, Alexander does the best thing he could possibly do, which is dies at the height of his power, but he lives long enough to scare the other Greek colonies, or the other Greek city-states. Because what's very interesting, if you remind yourself of what they actually knew about the world back then, a world that looks like this, he's conquering in this direction over here, but in theory, if you go far enough, you're going to reach the ocean. And if you reach the ocean, you can go all the way around and then pop up over here. And this was the fear. Because remember those Greek city-states and their colonies? Well, for example, one of the rival colonies, Phaeacia and Athens in this case, they had both set up these colonies over in the west. Well, they weren't so happy about Alexander the Great making all these conquests, because they were worried that he would conquer them next. And if you look at this, the Black Sea actually eventually connects via rivers to the Caspian Sea and then to the ocean. So it became incumbent upon these Greek colonies to go and explore the world, have a better understanding about geography, to maintain, in many respects, their own security and their own trade monopolies. And that is where one of the key people of our story comes in, and that's this chap over here. So his name is Pythéas or Massiliortes. So Pythéas of Massalia, or the Massalot. He lives in about the 4th century BC. We know almost nothing about him, and that's because everything that he did and wrote hasn't survived. It's only survived through other people quoting it. Think about that. Imagine all of your work only surviving through someone else writing about it. It's amazing that it survived at all, to be honest with you. So he comes from Massalia, modern-day Marseille. And what he does is he goes on an amazing voyage of discovery. He is the Christopher Columbus of the ancient world. And what he does is he takes the rivers up in this direction over here, and he arrives on the northwest coast of France. So he's standing over here. Who knows whether he's standing on Cherbourg or on Brittany. He's looking across the channel, and he sets sail, and he arrives somewhere in the British Isles. We don't know where. What he does for several years is he travels around on foot. So he actually sees everything with his own eyes. He doesn't sail around the coast. He actually goes and visits places. And what's amazing is that some of his stories have survived in other people. Eventually, he arrives in the Orkney Islands and then travels away over to Norway. Some people think that he might have travelled to Iceland or to the Faroe Islands, but he says these places are peopled, they're inhabited. And at this time, neither of those places were inhabited, but Norway was. So, what does he say about his travels? Well, have a look at this. This is what survived. And it survived again through this chap over here, through our friend Diodorus. Without Diodorus, we would not know anything about this chap, Pythéas of Massalia. We wouldn't know anything about his life. So what he says opposite Gaul, which lies in the ocean directly from Hercynian Forest, it's called, It's the largest of any European island, and it's known as Britain. He says that in ancient times, it was never visited by any of the Greek heroes. So Dionysius from the Homeric stories, or Heracles, these people are known to have visited places in the Mediterranean, but not the British Isles. That's very interesting. And it's not until Caesar actually visited that any information was available to them. At present, we should discuss the island of Britain and the tin which is found in it. Now, folks, you don't need to be a geologist to know this. There's only 2 places in this country where tin comes from. That is from Devon, and that is from Cornwall. And so any reference to tin within the British Isles is a reference to us by Greek people from 2,000 years ago. You've got to pinch yourself, because I think it's amazing. He says that Britain is triangular in shape, very much like Sicily. Remember, he's a Sicilian, so he's trying to relate this to something that Sicilian people would understand. He says the sides are unequal. One of the promontories is called Cantium. Where could that be? How about Kent? Kent, exactly. So you're looking at a triangle. You've got Kent on one end. What about the other part? Well, he mentions Orkneys, and that leaves the 3rd point of the triangle. And he gives the name to that as Belerium. Well, this is interesting, because there's only one place the 3rd point in the triangle could be, and that is us, Land's End, the southwest, the Cornish Peninsula. And so this is a Greek person from 2,000 years ago, 2,100 years ago in his case. But in the case of Pythéas, who he's epitomizing, this is from about 2,300 years ago. And he's describing us. I think that's amazing. He says it's a voyage from about 4 days from the mainland. He says that the local people, they use chariots, but there's not that much evidence of wheeled vehicles in Cornwall at this time period. So that's a bit strange. He says, as for their habits, they are simple and far removed from the shrewdness and vice that characterise men of our day. Think about that. That could almost be a sort of newspaper headline of the 1st century BC, couldn't it? It's wonderful. He says it is held by many kings and potentates, for the most part live in peace among themselves. This is the really exciting bit over here. He then goes on to say that we should give a detailed account of the customs of Britain later on. However, we shall discuss the tin in which the island produces now. The inhabitants of Britain who dwell among the promontory known as Belerium, or Belerion in the Greek sense, are especially hospitable to strangers and have adopted a civilized manner of life because of their intercourse with the merchants of other peoples. They it is who work the tin, treating the bed in which bears it in an ingenious manner. This bed, being like rock, contains earthy seams, and in them the workers quarry the ore, which they then melt down and cleanse of its impurities. They then work the tin into pieces the size of astragale. What are astragale? We'll come to that later. And they convey it to an island that lies off Britain and is called Ichthys. For at the time of ebb tide, the space between the island and the mainland becomes dry, and they then take the tin in large quantities over to the island in wagons. What does that sound like? If you don't want to say it, think it in your head. But then he goes on to say something peculiar. He says that the neighbouring islands to Ichthys also have the same phenomenon. They are also intertidal. On the island of Ichthys, the merchants purchase the tin of the natives and carry it from there across the Strait of Gaul. And finally, making their way on foot through Gaul for some 30 days, they bring the wares on horseback to the mouth of the River Rhone. This is the river that comes out at Marseille. Isn't that fascinating? That's 2,000 years old. What are these astragale? Well, when I was in Rome last time in the Forum Romana, in Rome obviously, I found these things here. And underneath it, you can see astragale. Well, what are they? Well, it turns out if you can look closely, they're actually bones. They're bones from a goat. Specifically, they're bones from what we would have as wrist bones from a goat. So it's sort of the front limbs of a goat. They're all a pretty uniform size, and what they would have been used for in the Forum Romana. And the Forum Romana is like the town square of Rome. All right, so it's a place where everyone gathered. You know, you'd have beggars, you'd have street preachers, you'd have everyone between gamblers. They'd be used as gaming tokens. And so they'd be used very similarly to how we use marbles today. In fact, they'd play games where you'd literally draw a ring and you'd be tossing these things in just like you play marbles today. And so astragale would have been a word that would have been, or astragalis would have been a word that would be completely recognizable to anyone from antiquity. But it's kind of lost us now today. What they're talking about really is the scale. You don't have an astragalis that's the size of your head or an astragalis that's the size of a pin needle. An astragalis is that size there, very, very particularly, which I think is interesting. And then next to it, in the next exhibit, they weren't quite next to each other, but we found these. So these are metal ingots from the Forum Romana. Look at this. They're not identical, but they're pretty similar, aren't they? Most importantly, they're similar in scale. They're not similar in size or in shape so much, but the scale is about right. You've got copper on this side, and then you've got what I presume is tin over here. So this is what they're talking about. The ingots that were being conveyed to Ichthys, they're not great big things that you had two people to lug around. They're the sort of things that you conveniently slip in a pocket. I think it's quite fascinating. This is the original text, or somewhat the original text, at least in the original language. And I've highlighted the key words over here. So these are proper nouns and things that I'm interested in. You've got, for example, Belerion. That is the ancient Greek word for us, for the place that you're sitting in right now. That is the name the Greeks had for us. That's really cool. You've got Cassiterides over there as well. Notice that he's using the tau form rather than the sigma form. That's actually quite interesting because that's an Attican form. So what he's trying to do there is essentially be posh. It's a posh way of writing. The plebs would write sigma. You've got a few interesting words over here. You've got Pretanikes, written with a P or a pi, which I think is quite interesting. And you've got Rodanon at the bottom down there. So I said that this was the original text. It's not. This is what's known as an edited text. So it's not like this man over here went to the printers and printed a load of Greek books. That's something that happened in the Renaissance. How did this text survive from antiquity? Well, I guess when I started studying this, I had this image in my head of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, somebody going to an old archive, digging the thing up, and then publishing it for the first time. It wasn't like that. These texts here, the classics, have never been forgotten. They've never been truly lost. They're part of living traditions. The reason they survive to this day is because there is a direct continuity between this man's time and our own through the works of medieval scribes and monks. So in the universities and the monasteries around Europe, these books, the only way that you could copy them would be by hand. And so quite literally from the time of this man over here, he would have written his book originally, what's known as the archetype, on papyrus. And then later on, somebody came up with the fancy idea of parchment. It's a bit morbid if you think about it, writing on skins, but they persevere very well. And so those then were then bound into books, into codices, and eventually some bright sparks in Germany or in Italy got hold of it in the Renaissance and then published it in the form that we'd recognise today. So there is a living continuity between these texts from our time and his time. And the way that classicists actually go and work out how these texts would have looked back in antiquity, you've got to remember that each time that they're copied, if the scribe makes a mistake or they copy it slightly differently, that's changed the text forever. How do you know that it's an authentic text? Well, you compare. And of course, in Europe, in the medieval university libraries of Europe, there are dozens of these things. In the case of this man's book, Diodorus, the one that preserves Pythéas' account that we've read from, there's about 60 of them. And so you can actually plot all of these out. If you do the incredibly laborious job of transcribing them all, you can see where certain manuscripts preserve the same errors, where the scribe has copied something slightly wrong. If they preserve errors, you know that one manuscript has been copied from another. And then you can put these things in date order, and you can construct what's known as a stemma or stemma de manuscript. And that's what we've got just over here. What it reveals is that all of the texts that we ever read from this classics, in this particular case, it descends from 4 prototype manuscripts. You will never know anything more about the subject matter at hand that we're talking about today than learning from each one of these texts in turn. And that's what I wanted to do. Now that I caught the bug, I was so deeply invested in it all, I wanted to actually go and look at those manuscripts, find them and see them for myself, and also see if there's anything that was missed by the editors that were doing this study. I mentioned the medieval libraries. One of the best examples in the UK is actually at Hereford. So if you ever go to Hereford, has anyone been to Hereford Cathedral? Did you go to the library? You went to... Fantastic. So there's been 2 mentions of Hereford in this talk. The first one was Anathemundi, actually. The Chain Library, one of the best places you can go to imagine what this would have looked like. The only reason that this man survives and that I can give this talk is because of places like this. This one's actually from the 16th century. All the chains, they're not for theft, they're actually for bookmarks. But that's how they've been preserved. So what I did is I tracked down, remember that earliest manuscript? In fact, let me just show you that very quickly. So this manuscript here, if you look, this is the earliest that's available. This dates from about the early 10th century, and I wanted to go and find this one. It's actually in the Naples National Library, the Biblioteca Nazionale di Napoli. And I wrote off to them in Italian, did a terrible job of it, but you know, they played along. And eventually they sent me back this. And I was so excited to get this manuscript finally, because no other Cornish person has bothered to do this. Why would you? However, it was all Greek to me. In this case, very much literally. And I didn't know where to start. The lucky thing was, after a while of flicking through the images, I saw this page. And if you zoom into this page, you can see at the top, just here, Peri, this is the pi with the epsilon above it, tes Britannicas. So we were on something here. This is the section that's on the island of Britain. And so what I did from that point is I really scoured the text. Were there any little clues? Yes?
Why is that written?
So this is the manuscript. This is handwritten, and the main text is just printed text. So if you look at this just here, the real clue comes in the marginal notes. So these things were written on papyrus scrolls back in the day. So you'd have to scroll the whole thing out, just like you'd read the Torah in Judaism. And so there's no point in having contents lists or indexes. And so what the monks would do is they would put these little marginal notes, and that's what you'd have to go off. So I found this one. This is really exciting because if you look very closely, it says Peri Cassiterides. This is where I got really excited. I saw the next one over here, and this one says Peri Electron, and that means on amber. This is really cool because the reason that we call the electron, as in the particle, the electron, is because static electricity was first observed in amber. So I was on my way. I managed to find out where the chapters were in here. So this book, the person that wrote this book never saw this manuscript himself. So I was really delving deep at this stage here. At that stage, you could go in and find out where the proper nouns, those words that we highlighted earlier in the text. I had to go at the grammar, and the grammar is a bit of a red herring. But down here, if you look at this is the really cool part. The way it's actually spelt in the original manuscript is actually quite different from this book here. This is why I wanted to do it. You can see, for example, our name for Cornwall is actually not Belerion with a B, but it's Ulerion with an upsilon, just there. You can adjust the pronunciation somewhat, but the spelling is with Ulerion. So I knew that I was about to discover the thing that I really, really, really wanted to find. That reference to Ichthys that we talked about earlier. There's one place I wanted to know. It was where Ichthys was, because so many historians have studied this. This is going to be my new little piece. And in this page is hiding Ichthys. It took me so long to go through the whole text, which is actually, I still have it here, and work out where this was. I'll give you a moment if you like. Can you spot it in here? It took me a while. Don't worry, I'm the same as you. There it is, folks. De Ichtin. That is the earliest reference to that place that you will ever find. Short of going into the Aegean and getting your trowel out and digging something out of the ground for the first time, you will never ever see an earlier reference to that text than this. And what's nice is that research is now done, so no one else has to do it. So I didn't stop there. I hadn't filled my boots. I did exactly the same with the other manuscripts as well. This is one in the Vatican Library. This is also from the 10th century, but a little bit later, so about sort of 30 or 40 years later. And there we go. There's the Ichtin reference, and you can see it lurking in just here, De Ichtin. And I did the same with the Florence National Library copy as well. It's somewhere in here. Can you spot it? Don't worry. It took honestly, what I'm showing you in the space of seconds here took me weeks. That's what bloody mindfulness does. There it is down at the bottom. So De Ichtin once again. So what you can do is then you can put all this together. You can highlight the manuscript, and this collectively is all that you will ever be able to know from a manuscript perspective about this subject matter. That is, I would highly imagine that no historian with any interest in Cornwall whatsoever has ever gazed upon this. So it's a real pleasure to present this to you. It's been a lot of research to do that, work together. So what can we pull out of this? Well, we can pull out the orthography, so the words that were used. There's a few interesting ones. First of all, Kaisaros, Kaiser, Caesar. So this is actually Julius Caesar's name. It's interesting to look at how it's rendered in Greek versus in Roman or Latin. There's a lot of differences. A lot of people put a lot of onus on the exact spelling of words, but you can see there's a huge variation that's possible. Bretanian, of Britain, just there. Cassiteron, again, he's using the Attican posh form. Valerion, which is our name. Geodes. This is a really cool one. So if you're a geologist, this is where your profession comes from, Geodes. It means coming from the earth. Astragalon, that's the shape of the ingots that we were talking about there. You also got rhythmos. So rhythmos is the word that's used to describe the shape of astragala, as the astragalon. Why are they using rhythm as a word to describe shape? Well, if you think about it, when you say that a poem or music has rhythm, you're describing the shape of the meter. We're actually using a metaphor of Greek when we use that word today, which I think is kind of cool. Another word that I love is philotechnos, which is the love of the method, or basically a very skilled person. And then philoxenoi. Philoxenoi is really cool. It means love of strangers, hospitable. And then we got ictin at the bottom. Hang on a second, I was talking about ictis earlier. So why is this ictin down here? Well, we'll go over that in a minute. I've actually worked on my own translations. They're not very good. If any of you know Greek in this room over here, there is lots to criticise about this. Don't worry, I know. But I've tried to translate just the lemme without looking at the inflections and the case endings too much. And when you look down here, my translation is actually quite different from the translation they use. The few words that I've been really focusing on here are Petrodes, Diaphuas, and Geodis. We know Geodis is earth-like. Petrodes is again sort of stony, or of stones. But then this one over here, Diaphuas, it really should be, it should be a noun, but he's using it as an adjective. So it's sort of almost gerundive in a way. So he's actually adapting the language to suit his novel phenomenon. In short, this is a man making a scientific observation about a new phenomenon. So in total, you can, my translation is actually substantially quite different from the one that's kept in the book. By the way, the book translation is really, really good, but it dates from the 1930s, and the man had no interest in Cornwall specifically. And so actually going and translating it yourself does reveal quite a lot of interesting things. Out of that, you can pull some textual axioms. These are factual statements that are not up for dispute, that people can agree upon, and there's about 20 in total, and this is what you can use to study the text with. So going back to the orthography, why is it ictin and not ictis? Well, what I did is I went and made a little noun declension table, all of this. So I'm not fluent in any languages, probably not even English, to be honest with you. But of course, the first thing you must understand is that Greek and English are quite different languages at a fundamental level. English is what's known as an analytical language. To convey meaning, particularly who the subject and object of a sentence is, we tend to add words or change the order. But it turns out that other languages, including modern languages like French and Spanish, they actually rely on what's known as inflections. So they change the word to describe who's being spoken about and other aspects of the speech that's being communicated. Greek was exactly the same. And so when you look at a Greek word like this, you actually have to it will depend on the case, the way that you the way that you spell the suffix. So look at this. Here's our ictin down here that we saw earlier, right down at the bottom. But here is our ictis. So it turns out that actually in the nominative form, we have ictis, but in the accusative, it's ictin. Now we saw from the manuscripts, remember, it was never referred to as ictis. It was always referred to as ictin in the manuscripts. We never saw ictis at all. And that's because the translator, and translation is a really difficult job, by the way, so you have to make concessions with this, especially when you're translating from a synthetic to an analytical language. He has rendered it in its nominative form, as we would probably expect in English. However, he has assumed that it's a standard declension, and not all declensions are standard. And so the reality is, we actually don't know what the nominative of ictis is. The only word that we actually know is ictin. So if you hear ictis, it's a sort of a translation. It's a fluke of translation in many respects. The original word would have undoubtedly just been ict by itself. That's what it would be, what the local people would have referred it to, probably with their own inflections. But what's really cool about doing this is that you can then use you can impress your friends by saying that ictin is the feminine singular accusative of the noun. So that will impress a sum total of 0 people. Don't bother. So the question is, where was this place? I've been rambling on about it. Where was it? Well, remember that description about it being tidal? It immediately ties it to St Michael's Mount. It's a great, there's so few tidal islands in the British Isles, and St Michael's Mount is a really prominent one, and it's next to known tin mines, so it's a really good candidate. However, really, if St Michael's Mount was Ictus, it should appear in other references as well, because there are other descriptions of the same place. Perhaps this chap over here can help us. His name is Claudius Ptolemaeus, or Claudius Ptolemy. He is an Alexandrian or Ptolemaic Greek. What that means is he's an Egyptian. He's sitting down here in Alexandria, in Egypt, and what he does, he's a mathematician, so he's interested in looking upwards at the stars, and his first book, well, his first important book, called the Almagest nowadays, Mathematics and Taxis in his own language, he is trying to project the map of the stars on the inside of a sphere. So he's trying to basically build an astrolabe. And he goes, in that book, written about 145 AD, so the 2nd century AD, he teases this. He says, now that I've worked this out for the stars, I'm going to turn my attention to the Earth. Of course, he says this in Greek. And what he does is he then becomes a geographer, but a mathematical geographer using all his mathematics that he has learned. He collects together coordinates that have been recorded from all the places across Europe and the known world, all the way as far as Asia. And he plots them, or he records them in his book. Now, I haven't plotted them for the rest of Europe. This whole map would be red if that were the case. What I have done is I've taken his description of the British Isles and plotted all the points that he mentions. Look at how many there are. There are 190 different places that this man, an Egyptian from nearly 2,000 years ago, was able to record about the British Isles. If you think that these people didn't know much about us, you are mistaken, my friends. They knew so much about us, and this is only what has survived. So, of course, I couldn't be dragged away from the prospect of finding the original manuscripts, and so that's exactly what I did over here. Went back to the Vatican Library, which most of it is online now. Actually, it's quite nice, and I found this manuscript. And again, I just presented with this impenetrable wall of Greek. But eventually, after a lot of scouring, I managed to find the section that talks about the British Isles. And what I've done is I've extracted the sections that talk about Devon and Cornwall. This is so much fun doing this, honestly. If you look really closely, now you won't be able to see this because it's just the resolution isn't quite there. You've actually got Temaron mentioned. Where could that be? Tamar, exactly. And I tell you what, when you plot out his coordinates, it's exact. So he knows about the river Tamar. He knows about the river Sinio, or Kinio, which is probably, if I say it again, Kinio, Kinion, what does that sound like? Kenwyn, maybe? Sounds a little bit like Kenwyn, doesn't it? That's my own theory. That hasn't been confirmed there. So maybe he's talking about the river Kenwyn as well. But what's interesting down here, he has Belerion as well. We've already heard that word. So we're anchoring places on the map already. He actually calls, for example, Lizard Point as Belerion Akron, or which is the word for promontory, or Anti-Westeon Akron, and he calls the Lizard Point Damnonian or Okrinon Akron. And so he knows a huge amount about us. Down here, you've got a mention that's very interesting to a place called Wictis. So where's Wictis? Well, it turns out that Wictis is actually the Isle of Wight. So this is very interesting. Let's compare this, because it's not like St Michael's Mount isn't a good candidate. It's actually where the tin mines are. However, Wictis over here is a very important island in its own right. It's not tidal, so that's a big question. But it's the first place that you reach if you come over from Cherbourg. That's quite interesting. All of the places that you see on this map have been plotted from Ptolemy. This is not a Google Maps. This isn't something that's been produced in recent times. This is the work of an Egyptian doing this. Think about that. That's amazing. Look at how many places there are in Cornwall. One of the other ways that we can study this is if we look at places where the Greeks or Greek objects have been found in the British Isles. If you find a Greek object in the British Isles, it's not unreasonable to assume that a Greek person could have come with it. When you take the data, for example, from the Portable Antiquities Scheme, which is a place for registering fines for metal detectorists, and you plot out all the Massilian Massilian coins, or the pontins, which are made out of tin, typically from Massilia as well, or the Greek and Roman provincial coins, you get a map like this. And you can see there's a real concentration around Dover. There's also a real concentration around the Isle of Wight hinterland, but there's also a few down St Michael's Mount as well. So who knows? Well, Ptolemy produced, ultimately, his maps were rediscovered in medieval times. And they used to produce maps like this. This map is special because this was produced, I think, in the early 15th century. This map is special because this was the most accurate map. And I say that with a big pinch of salt, look at Scotland. But this was the most accurate map that had been produced in the British Isles until Christopher Saxon in 1570. So what's that, 1,300 years? The best map of British Isles was an Egyptian map. Do you think that's cool? So, where was Ictis? Well, let's compare the names. Could it be the case that the Wictis over here is the same as the Ictin, and the same as the Mictin, which comes from Pliny? Well, first of all, we saw there's a huge scope for variation in names, like, for example, Caesaros to Caesar. So it's not unreasonable to suspect that could have changed. But also the pronunciation changed over time. For example, you had iotarization of the eta just there. So could it be the case that actually the names are the same and they're just transmuted? Well, if that is the case, then this would be the way that the name for the Isle of Wight has transmuted over the years. From Ictin, in the references that we've seen, to Wectis. You've got to remember that V's in Roman were pronounced as W's. So Wectis, to Wictis, to Wecta, to Wictis, to Wictis, to Gwith in Welsh records, and finally to the Wit of the Domesday Book, and of course to Wight. So who knows? One of the other things we've got to consider is what were these places actually intertidal at the time? St Michael's Mount, we imagine it as this static place that doesn't change. It turns out that the climate, of course, was radically different. And indeed, actually, the sea level in Mounts Bay seems to have changed quite a lot as well. One of the variables that hasn't been considered before is this really fancy word over here called glacio-isostatic adjustment. What is that? We all know about the Ice Age. When there was a huge ice sheet above the lithosphere in this part of England over here, it meant that basically it's very heavy. The lithosphere, or the Earth's crust, was compressed downwards. It sunk. It was inverted in geological speak. But what this meant was that the periglacial zone, the zone around the glaciers, by action of levers, as one side was pushed down by the glacier, the other side was pushed up. And so actually the region of Devon and Cornwall, which was never glaciated, but next to the glaciers, actually experienced huge amounts of uplift during the Ice Age. Now, what happens when the glaciers melt? Well, of course, when all that weight is released, well, the part that was sunk, that was inverted, then wants to rise up, it experiences uplift. But the periglacial zone, bits next to the glacier, that's us, we then experience inversion or sink. And so ever since the last Ice Age, we have been sinking relative to the rest of the UK. And that's what this map represents. The isobars, starting off with red, have actually represent how much the lithosphere, or the Earth's crust, has risen relative to itself or sunk. Look at this. The isobar inverts at Plymouth. So what this means is that Cornwall has been sinking relatively to the rest of the UK, which has been rising. What does that mean for St Michael's Mount? Well, we can study it using this. So this is the surf zone data set from the Environment Agency, and you can get it for Mounts Bay. If you're interested in marine surveys, this is fascinating because you can see the seabed. It's really cool. It looks like there's no water. This is all usually covered. So what I did is I took this data for St Michael's Mount particularly, and I created this contour map, not only of the land, but also of what would normally be covered by water. And what it turns out, when you factor in the glacio-isostatic adjustment, it turns out that St Michael's Mount, the land at St Michael's Mount, was at least about a metre higher. We think it could have been between about half a metre to a metre higher in the past. What that means is that it wouldn't have been tidal necessarily. In fact, it could have just been a peninsula at this time period. In fact, a few of the radiocarbon dates for the forest actually come back from the Roman time period. Do you guys know the name of St Michael's Mount in the Cornish language? What does it mean? Grey rock in the wood. Now, I think that's interesting. Could it be the case that actually St Michael's Mount wasn't an island, but was a peninsula back then? The simple answer is that we don't know yet. There's more study that can be done on this, but it's not obvious that this actually fits with the description of Ictis that we're talking about. Let's compare it to the Isle of Wight. The Isle of Wight is definitely not tidal. The Solent's 50 metres deep. But look a bit further north. What about these islands over here? This is where it gets really interesting. Because, of course, one of the other descriptions that this chap uses is he says that the other islands next to it are also intertidal. When the tide is out, they look like headlands. When the tide is in, they're islands. Well, look at this. You've got Hayling Island, Thorney Islands, Portsea Island, Selsey Island. These are all tidal islands, ladies and gentlemen. Now, look at this as well. You can see, looking at this height map, you can see it's extremely low-lying ground, and there's no ancient field boundaries. This is all reclaimed land over here that would have previously been salt marshes. Remember, this part of the earth here has actually, if anything, it's sort of risen slightly since this time period. Only a few millimetres, but it's risen. Let's focus on Hayling Island over here, for example. So look at this. They work the tin into size Mastrogali and they convey it to the island of Ichthys in wagons over a causeway, essentially. Look at this. You've got the modern road, an older bridge, but look at this. Do you see that there? That's a causeway just like St Michael's Mount. I have no idea how old this is. I haven't found any references in literature to it at all. And who knows whether it's even that old in any respect. But this could be the place that this man was talking about. And of course, don't forget, you've got a modern sailing mecca right next to it. This is the place that people want to sail to. St Michael's Mount, for all its pros and all its beauty, is not an ideal sailing destination. One of the things you've got to think about is that Ichthys is the Isle of Wight, but in the same way that we call Snowdonia the place that's named after the mountain, perhaps it's the hinterland of the Isle of Wight that's being referenced here. Either way, whether it's St Michael's Mount, close to where the tin is being produced, or Ichthys itself, or Wictus, I should say, over here at the Isle of Wight, either place is a good candidate. The one thing that we know about Ichthys, though, is that for every other metal, that was the place that every other metal was traded, whether it was copper, whether it was lead, whether it was silver, whether it was anything else that was produced in the British Isles, it always went through Wictus. We actually think that it would have been the London Metal Exchange of its time. However, there is one place, if we can't figure out where Ichthys is, we know where the tin was coming from. This is the really interesting thing. Let's zoom in over here in Devon, because this tin work here at Crown Hill Down, which is where they now have the tungsten mine, just near Plimpton, there were excavations here in 2015, and what they uncovered was a sequence in the tin work, a relative chronology that could be studied, and the sequence starts in the red zones just there in, would you believe it, the 4th century BC, exactly the time of Pythéas. And so wherever the tin was going, the tin was coming from places, presumably, like this. The way they did this actually was a technique called optically stimulated luminescence dating, which is a ludicrously fancy word, and the technique is actually quite fancy itself. But it's quite amazing. They're able to date sediments that haven't been exposed to sunlight, and you can work out how long they haven't been exposed to sunlight for. So, remember, wherever it's coming from, wherever it's going, it's coming from the southwest. And it's being transported to Massilia. For example, this is a Massilian coin that was found in the Isle of Wight hinterland. And you can see it from the Massilian bull just here. This could have been lost from Pythéas' pocket. Now, once it leaves Ichthys, wherever that might be, it's going to arrive on the coast of France. And it wants to get down here to Rome. And the way it's going to do that is by following these river courses. And I tell you what, it's a jolly good deal, actually. You've got rivers that go almost all the way into France, over a very short overland journey here to Lyon, and then you've got almost a straight sail downwards. And what's wonderful is that later Greek authors describe this in so much detail, quite literally almost a sort of a navigation guide, turn by turn. And so they're taking it along these river courses inland, and the boats they would have used would have looked a bit like this. So this is actually a contemporary model of a boat from the 4th century BC. It's found in Ireland, in a place called Broita, therefore it's called the Broita boat. And so this is the style of boat that would have been used by these people to traffic this tin. So who knows, if Ichthys was St Michael's Mount, this is the kind of boat that would have been sailing there. I think that's kind of cool. Now, this one's nice and shiny and gold. The reality is they would have looked a bit more like that. Not quite so spectacular. Now, believe it or not, folks, who said coracle? Did someone say coracle? It's a big coracle. There's a fancy word for it, and it's a curragh. It's absolutely spot on. I like you guys. So it's a curragh boat. In a minute, I'm almost finished. So these curragh boats over here, folks, they're made out of wicker to give them their shape, and then they're waterproofed using skins, using leather. I'm not sure I want to sail across the seas on it, but apparently they were seaworthy. So oh, that's interesting. Oh, fascinating. Thank you. We'll talk more about that afterwards. So, folks, this is the map that we've got to have in our minds over here. All of these mines in Spain. We've talked about Cornwall and Devon for so long now, but it's Spain really that is the key with this. In fact, if you look at distribution of mines, Spain is vastly overrepresented. It's producing more minerals than the rest of Europe combined as far as we know. And actually, there are quotes that describe it to this effect. For example, this author here, Pliny, we skip forward a few hundred years, but his description is relevant and contemporary to what we're discussing. He's discussing the nature of lead. He says there are two kinds. He says there's black lead and white lead. This is actually a reference to Assyrian literature. So if you go back to the Bronze Age, the Assyrians and the Egyptians would call white lead, they call tin white lead, and then normal lead, black lead. It's quite interesting actually, and that was the same with the Romans. White lead is the most valuable, tin, and the Greeks called it kasharos. So he recognised this straight away. Cassiterides, it's not an indigenous European term. It is actually an ethnonym that comes from the Persian Gulf. In fact, there was a civilization called the Kassites, and these were some of the first people that trafficked tin through the Fertile Crescent back in the Bronze Age. And so the name that the Greeks applied to it, because the Cypriot Greeks, the Cypriot Minoan Greeks, will go and travel to, for example, the courts of the Mari, which is modern-day Lebanon and Syria, and they go and traffic this stuff. So the name that was applied to it was actually a name from the Persian Gulf, which I think is quite fascinating. He says there's a legendary story going to the Atlantic Ocean to fetch it. This is a reference to the Cassiterides. And he talks about these plated vessels made of osier and covered in stitch hides. This is a good example of somebody doing an accurate translation, but not a very useful translation. The real translation is just a curragh. It is now known that it is a product of Lusitania and Galicia. Hang on a second. What's he talking about? Tin is not a place that comes from the Atlantic, Cornwall and Devon, but it's a place that comes from Spain. What's that about? Well, he is writing the 1st century AD, but hang on a second, let's go a bit deeper. It's found in the subsurface strata of the ground, which is sandy and of a black colour. I actually have a piece of cassiterite with me somewhere. I think it's on the table. Do have a look at it afterwards. This is the description that he's giving of this. It is only detected by its weight. Feel the weight of the stones afterwards as well. And also in tiny pebbles, which occasionally occur in the dry beds of torrents, where you also find gold. This is fascinating. If you know anything about tin working, the earliest tin workings always happened in stream beds, just in the same way that you pan for gold. This is a man from 2,000 years ago describing that process as if we were describing it ourselves. It's amazing. Black lead does not occur in Galicia, although in the neighbouring country of Biscay, it's found black lead only. He eventually goes on to say that that stagnum is an alloy that is used to go and solder two metals together. It's nonsense. But down here, the stagnum word, which is also the word, might I say, for a pond, is the word that we would then adopt as our own for tin working, which is stannum, which is where we get the word stannery. And so this might be one of the earliest references to that word just there. It's quite interesting. But wait, we have forgotten about our rival civilization. Remember that dichotomy we formed at the start of the talk? Greeks on the north, Phoenicians on the south. What are things you ought to think about? People often say the Phoenicians traded tin in Cornwall. I think that's a really interesting hypothesis, a really plausible one as well. Why wouldn't they trade tin? You know, we know that people were coming here, so why didn't they trade it? Well, the simple fact of the matter is that we don't have Phoenician archaeology. Phoenician archaeology is really obvious in the archaeological record. You can find it all throughout Spain. It's very obvious when you find those things. For example, it's obvious in the same way that those Greek coins that we find in the British Isles are. We don't find any Phoenician archaeology in the British Isles. And furthermore, the Phoenicians already had control of those Lusitanian, Galician, Iberian tin mines in Spain. Why did they bother coming to us if they already had control of those resources themselves? Well, the Greeks would bother coming here because the Greeks didn't have control of Spain. This is interesting. That dichotomy was all set to change beginning in the 3rd century BC. This is the landscape that I've just described. Southern Mediterranean controlled by the Phoenicians or the Punics. Northern Mediterranean controlled by the Greeks and the Romans. And in fact, it's that latter civilization, the Romans, that we haven't really discussed yet. These are the people that are starting to grow, starting to get powerful. They've adopted many of the Etruscan ways of living. They're doing well. They've beaten their local tribes. And now they're starting to look towards trade. They want to be regional hegemons. They want to control their landscape. And so they're going to go to war with Carthage. Spoiler alert, folks, doesn't go well for the Punics. They lose epically. It's a really sad story, actually, because when this occurs, the sacking of Carthage, it is an absolutely brutal event. The word we would apply to it now would be genocide. To give you an idea of this civilization, this is a civilization with literacy, with drama, with the arts, with science, just the same as Greece. Today, there are only 10 lines of prose that survive in Punic. A whole civilization with its own literacy, and all that survives are 10 lines in Poenulus, an old Latin play. That is a true destruction of a civilization. In fact, the story goes that they ploughed salt into the fields after they were defeated, so that they would never be able to grow anything there again. So quite brutal. And of course, when this occurs, the whole geopolitical landscape of trade changes. And that is what I want to discuss in the part 2 of this talk. So folks, I'm very sorry to cut this off, but it has to be done. It's a very detailed topic. It's now turning out to be a 4-part series. You don't have to ask me back, but I will be doing it. The first part, of course, is the thing that you have seen already. The second part, we will begin where we left off. So we'll begin at the start of the Punic Wars. We'll investigate how that changes, and then we'll look at what happened under the Roman occupation, because the Roman occupation is the next big thing that happens to us. And then we'll conclude that talk by the time that the Romans leave, by the rescript of Honorius, by the time that the Roman Britannia is seceded from the empire. There's a part 3 as well, and the part 3 is I'll be presenting next year, and that's going to be focusing on what happened after the Romans left us, what happened in the medieval time period, for example, Tintagel. And then I've also got a part 4. This is a really exciting bit. So I've been teaching myself the basics of like Assyriology, so cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs. And I want to show you what was actually going on in the terms of the literate and historical record for tin trade back at that time period. And so in that part, we'll also talk about what tin looks like in Egyptian hieroglyphs, for example, or Cretan linear A and B, or indeed Assyrian cuneiform, because it is in the record. And I'll show you one example of it just here. Before I do show you that, this is the timeline that we've been representing. What I've done here is I've taken the recorded production of tin. So this is what we know was produced, and it starts from about 1150 all the way through to the present. For 800 years, we know exactly how much tin Devon and Cornwall produced. That is an amazing record, and there's no other industry that's comparable. But on the same scale, you can see this is how far away the events that we were discussing. We've seen the Carpetani epitaphs just here, and then Caesar's invasion of Britain and Pythéas' voyage to Ictus. And so it's not that far ago. I think it's interesting to look at. So this is what I was talking about here. So you can see in this is actually this is quite amazing. This is from the 24th millennium BC, 24th century BC, sorry. So that's 2,400 years ago. This is contemporary, for example. What's it contemporary with in Cornwall? It's contemporary with Below Barrow, for example. So whilst Below Barrow is being built, whilst a lot of the earliest, whilst a lot of the Solonian entrance graves are being built, this is what's going on in the Near East. What's amazing is that those time periods in Cornwall, which we can only study through archaeology, we can literally just pick up a tablet and read it. We can let them tell us what's going on. And so in this tablet, if you look just here at these cuneiform inscriptions, this is written in a language called Eblate. You can see just here, it says Anna, which is tin, and then Agaga, which is this, Agaga, Anna, Anna, and Anna is the Eblate and Akkadian and Hittite word for tin. That's fascinating. This is the second oldest reference to tin that I've ever found. And that, folks, is the end of the talk. I'll just very quickly conclude by saying that, I'll put this up later on. You can scan that, and then there's a map that you can use that describes something that I'm talking about. some of my friends are doing an excavation on St Michael's Mount. They're looking for funding. If you're interested in that, they are running a project called Project Ancient Tin. You should thoroughly check out. I thoroughly recommend checking out the website. They've already found an amazing late Bronze Age hoard just over here as well. So they're clearly finding interesting things. Whether Ictus was the Isle of Wight or St Michael's Mount, it's excavations like this that we need to go and fully analyse these sorts of topics. So I thoroughly recommend checking them out. And that, folks, really is the end of the talk. Thank you for listening. Questions welcome. Please.
I'd love to read what you've spoken about. Have you published them?
Oh, not yet. Not yet. You're the first person who's asked. Yeah, I'll get round to it eventually. So I'm a professional researcher. I don't do this I'm not paid to do this. This is my own spare time that I do this research in, and I'm not asking for money. But but you know what it's like. Doing it in evenings and weekends is most of what you saw there with the Greek texts. I was sort of getting up at sort of 5 in the morning and doing that before work. It's a bit obsessive, really, to be honest with you. But you know, at some point, I will definitely publish it because it's really good fun. I think it's important for Cornwall because this is the earliest time that Cornwall can appear in literature, and it's the beginning of Cornish history. That's what I like. You know, we've got a foundation for that, and I really hope that by publishing it, other people can take what I've done and then do their own research on top of it as well. Use it for your own things. Well, the thing is, I'm not a classicist, so I don't take any of this for granted, you know, and so you know, the fun is sort of investigating these things, and you see that sense of discovery each time you understand the word. But it is all understandable. You know, the difference between a classicist and an amateur such as myself is really only fluency. All the resources are available quite literally online nowadays if you know where to find them. Knowing where to find them is the hard part, by the way. But if you do want to do it yourself, you can do it. You won't be very good at it like me, but you can do it yourself. My pleasure. Go on, Jane. Yes. I think you're right. I think it's a really good point. A lot of Ptolemy's maps wrong. Scotland is 90 degrees out of whack. I think it could do. You've got to remember that Ptolemy never left his office. You know, he's actually collecting accounts from a guy called Marinus of Tyre. So Tyre in the Lebanon. You have Tyre, Sidon, and so on and so forth. Presumably his sources are either Greek traders or Romans that have recently colonized the place. You could reasonably have both. I think that the accuracy isn't there. So the trouble with the map, plotting the map spatially, is that you have to make a variety of assumptions about his coordinate reference system. This is a problem for like mathematical people. The real thing that you should focus on is how closely spaced the points are. So how many points he bothers to record for a given region. I'll give you an example. For Scotland, he records a much higher density of places than the rest of the UK. Why is that? Scotland's further away from anywhere else, so surely London would be a much better candidate for that. Well, the answer is because at the time that he's writing, there's an ongoing campaign in Scotland, and where he would have had access to people who could have actually given him that information. I think Cornwall is really special. Cornwall's special because it has kind of two cardinal points. It has the most southerly and the most westerly. And both of those have not one but two names. So, for example, he says Valerion. He says Valerion Tokai anti Westeon Akron, which is so he has an old name and a new name in essence for that, and it's exactly the same for the Lizard Point. He says, "You're right there." No, don't worry. And so for the Lizard Point, he says, I've forgotten the name now. I think Ocrion Okrion akron Tokai Dumnonian Promontorium, which is of course a reference to the Dumnoni tribe that inhabited Devon and Cornwall right the way up and through till the sub-Roman period. I don't think he had a focus on Cornwall specifically, but the fact he had so many data points. The fact that he references I think 4 or 5 different towns, and he references multiple place names and whatever, some of which could indeed be the roots of our place name today. If it is the case that Kinion or Kinionas is Kenwyn, then that's literally the example of Cornish people taking a Greek name, or indeed the Greeks taking a Cornish name, but they've maintained the case ending. So at some point we've adopted the Greek case ending for it, which I think is quite remarkable. I think we'll never be able to prove that because there's just no other sources that are available. But they knew so much about us. Cornwall was really on the map, folks. In fact, if you asked a Greek person in Egypt about, for example, Land's End or Truro or Kenwyn River, they would have been able to tell you, oh yeah, I know that. That's written in our books. I think that's kind of cool.
I think it's really interesting the fact that about the Phoenicians, that there's no archaeological evidence, and yet it's, you always hear of this trade between Phoenicians and
It's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea at all, because we know that the Phoenicians were monopolizing the metal industry. We know that they were doing that. And so it's almost ludicrous to think that they weren't doing it in Cornwall. But the context is what matters. It's the fact that Phoenicians already had these super rich deposits in the form of the Spanish ones. Remember what Pliny said? He said that originally tin came from the west, and now it's coming from Spain. The key thing is that whoever controls Spain is the person that doesn't need to use Cornwall. Yeah. I think
very much better here. Considerably better here. It really is. Spain is spread out. Isolated places that are difficult to get to. A lot of the tin is very shallow. A lot of the tin is spoiled by the presence of tungsten.
Any more questions, folks? Please.
Is that this was traded, tin was traded. So what is it traded for?
Oh, I love that question. I love it. What was that, sorry? Spices is a really good example. Come on, what do we trade with France nowadays? Exactly, folks. That is the answer. It's the amphorae that are found in return in Cornwall that really give the clue. And what's wonderful is that's not a trade that then stops when the Romans leave. This is the best part about it. If you look, so my part 3 talk, the part 3 covers the period from when the Romans leave to when the first records of tin mining occur in the 1150s. And when those first records occur in the 1150s, what they're trading it for, come on guys, you know the answer already. It's lovely French red wine. And so they're trading it from Southampton over across to Bayeux, to La Rochelle, and so on and so forth. And they're trading it for wine and salt. Wine and salt. Any other questions? Well, folks, if you want to, you can scan that, and you will get the map of Ptolemy. So there you go. So anyone can scan that, and then you have. I think it's all in Greek, so you'll just have to put up with that. Thanks, everyone.